Hello, and welcome to part 10, the final part of the Unobstructed Way. Appendix 1, Echoes of Plato. Socrates said that philosophy is how we prepare to die. Since Plato and Thomas Taylor's translations of the Neoplatonists were so popular in America during the heyday of spiritualism, it's no surprise American metaphysical religion is saturated with Platonic ideas. Perhaps it is surprising, however, to find Platonism reaching a wide audience in 1940 by way of the Unobstructed Universe books, at least metaphorically. Plato believed that encasement in the body obscures the light of the soul. His message about the afterlife is that the living are, in fact, in the underworld. Caged in our bodies, we live as if in a cavern, a hole in a rock in the earth, obstructed, in other words. But the purified soul achieves liberation in an eternity without obstacles, unobstructed. In the Platonic dialogue, most often accused of being Orphic, the Phaedo, ignorant souls are condemned to lie in mud in the afterlife. We don't have much evidence about how the Orphics themselves envisioned the afterlife. Perhaps eternal sunlight shining on a beautiful scene of nature, like Pindar's meadow of purple roses. Plato's Orphic themes suggest some interesting possibilities. In his book, Myths of the Underworld Journey, Plato, Aristophanes, and the, quote, Orphic, unquote, gold tablets. Radcliffe G. Edmonds III writes about Plato, quote, in the Phaedo, he describes the unphilosophic as imprisoned in their materiality, unable to move beyond the phenomenal world, like ghosts who haunt graveyards because they are unable to make their way to Hades, end quote. Betty spent years mastering techniques that allowed her to enter the unobstructed consciously. And she lamented those, quote, gelatinous, unquote, souls who never developed an identity. They could not arrive in the unobstructed, while also being unable to remain in the physical world. They tumble like sleeping dreamers from one misunderstood experience to the next until they are reincarnated to try again. Edmonds writes, quote, the company of the blessed is delightful in Plato because of the purity and clarity of the upper world, unquote. Betty described the unobstructed the same way, vibrant, pure, and clear. Quote, moreover, Edmonds continues, Plato ascribes this traditionally post-mortem reward to the philosopher during his life, if he can sufficiently free himself from the undue consideration of the phenomenal world, end quote. Betty talked about the, quote, blood-sucking, end quote, details of life we can lose ourselves in, and how by freeing ourselves from them, we can not only arrive consciously in the afterlife, but also know that higher consciousness as much as we can while embodied, thereby living our lives with greater clarity. Plato refers to the fates of the, quote, ordinary dead, unquote, in the afterlife as suffering in mud and filth. The Invisibles talked about the consequences in the afterlife of a life lived in mud. Stewart liked to compare such souls to mud turtles and titled one of his earliest books about the unobstructed universe, "Why Be a Mud Turtle?" In Plato, the unphilosophic suffer not only in the afterlife, but in this one, whereas the philosophic are able to avoid many troubles. As we have seen, the Invisibles taught that the world is a great harmony, and by developing awareness, a soul can harmonize and thereby avoid what they called, quote, runaway trains, unquote, apparently random tragedies. The same ideas about harmony and avoiding harm are found in Plato and in Marsilio Ficino's work. The influential Renaissance Platonist, Marsilio Ficino, sometimes called the father of the Renaissance, wrote, quote, "While experiencing moving, flashing water, clear air, a fire not too close, the sky, you receive the motion of the life of the world," unquote. A similar technique to the one Stewart did when he suggested enjoying or recalling the splendors of nature to quiet the mind, expand the soul, and begin the process of spiritual contact and nourishment. A meditation suggested by the Invisibles began with appreciation of the beauties of nature, relaxed into gratitude, then envisioned a wide river or a waterfall of slowly flowing energy healing the body. When the Invisibles promised that spiritual contact can help us avoid accidents, it's highly unlikely that the Whites knew that Ficino had promised his friends in Florence 400 years earlier that the spiritual techniques he had learned from Plato, thrice great Hermes, and Iamblichus were good for, quote, avoiding the malice of fate, unquote. Were Stewart and Betty White secretly Platonists? Stewart did study for a degree in philosophy. Having received their educations at a time when Plato was an important part of the curriculum, it seems likely that they may have encountered the Platonic conception of the afterlife. Plato's name appears twice in the Betty book and twice in the Unobstructed Universe, but only briefly and in passing. The books the Whites wrote provide neither evidence of dedicated Platonic scholarship, nor do they ever refer to the similarities outlined here. Plato's influence on Western esotericism, however, is so strong that even 19th century American spiritualists, for the most part, conformed to Platonic ideas about the afterlife, reincarnation, and Atlantis, as shown in studies like Plato's Ghost, Spiritualism in the American Renaissance. Or perhaps Plato and the Invisibles, over 2,000 years apart, were communicating mysteries of life and death that are simply part of the human experience. A crucial difference between the Platonic dialogues and the Unobstructed Universe teachings is that the Platonic initiate who remembers takes only his reason with him. The body and the parts of consciousness that belonged to it are left behind. According to the Invisibles, we take with us everything except the physical body itself. When we remember our true selves, we remember what survives death. And so we remember everything we've experienced in all of our lives, and our emotions and affections remain intact. The individual is immortal. Part 2 of the appendix, The Unobstructed Secret of the Golden Flower. Quote, "My one regret is always that in bringing these things to consciousness, to a sharp focus of attention, I tend to make them pedantic. That is a price I pay in the pain of inadequate translation. I take life out of circulation and put it in a museum case. But I try to look on it as a gardener should. The blossom is over, but I have the seed, and it is that I'm giving you. End quote. Betty. Here, we consider the striking similarities between the descriptions of mystical experiences provided by a Chinese Daoist alchemical text written down in the late 1600s and the Betty books, spiritualist bestsellers in the late 1930s and early 1940s. When classic texts of spirituality from different centuries and cultures seem to agree and to provide insights into each other, it is important to remain skeptical about conclusions that depend on translations and subtle interpretations. Nevertheless, we offer one such mystery here: the secret of the golden flower considered alongside the unobstructed universe. The unobstructed universe teachings closely resemble the Taoism of the Quanzhen school, about which Stephen Eskildsen wrote, quote, "The ultimate goal of this is to gain immortality through the recovery of the radiant spirit or real nature that exists without beginning and without end. One who progresses in this endeavor is thought to gain health, longevity, and inner tranquility. Although physical death eventually occurs, the radiant spirit is thought to survive in an eternal life, unbound by the strife of samsara." End quote. In a summer of 1943 issue of his Horizon Journal, Manly Palmer Hall wrote of the secret of the golden flower, quote, "The Chinese philosophers say in substance, there is a little door in man, which being opened, permits the self, with a capital S, to fly out and go everywhere and be everything, thus losing forever its sense of limitation. In other words, when the supersubstantial self is perceived as the free soul, the birth or the death of the body no longer causes a limitation on that soul." End quote. Are Betty's benevolent invisibles all that different from the 12th century Quanzhen immortals, quote, "who can be prayed to for aid and guidance, or even encountered in meditative trances or dreams," end quote? Imagine life as the ultimate adventure ride, where the formless explores forms and the timeless experiences time. Imagine the infinite pretending to be finite. But this is a ride that begins with forgetting. It's designed to make us forget we're on a ride, so that we will mistake the ride for the only life we'll ever know. What would it be like to remember we're on the ride while we're on it? The Chinese alchemical classic, The Secret of the Golden Flower, according to Fabrizio Pregadio, a more accurate translation would be Teachings of the Ancestor on the Great Flower of Golden Unity. Among other transcendental topics, discusses the importance of remembering we are on that ride. Thomas Cleary translates the Chinese terminology for this transformation of consciousness as, quote, "turning around the light," end quote. The light of our consciousness, according to the secret of the golden flower, is always leaking into the physical world. Our consciousness pours out of us, chasing after objects, including objectified people and possible events that we desire or fear. We are tossed about by our emotions. Our thoughts make demands on us. Everything seems more real to us than our true selves, and more important. For many of us, any distraction is preferable to sitting quietly in self-reflection. What does it mean to turn around the light? How do we focus on the source of consciousness? Perhaps the most direct method was taught by the Hindu sage Sri Ramana Maharshi as a contemplation involving a number of steps. Here is a simplified version. We are not our bodies. Every body has a will of its own. Our bodies sometimes frighten us with unexpected experiences. We have bodies, but we are not our bodies. We're not the five senses. Those who lack one or more of the five senses are no less human. We are not what we say or what we do. Speech and actions only reflect facets of our complicated psyches. Are we our thoughts? They are ever changing, sometimes becoming the opposite of how they began. We are all of this, and yet none of it. As Ramana Maharshi said, quote, "If I am none of these, then who am I?" After negating all of the above mentioned as not this, that awareness with a capital A, which alone remains, that I am, end quote. In The Secret of the Golden Flower, we are told of a lower soul and a higher soul. In the Rig Veda, this is symbolized by a simple but profound symbol. Quote, two birds on a branch. One bird eats, the other watches, end quote. The bird absorbed in eating is the lower soul. The bird watching is the higher. But they are not really separate. They are one. The process of the secret of the golden flower is described elsewhere in the Vedas in this wonderful mantra. Quote, from Maya to truth, from darkness to light, from death to immortality, end quote. The lower soul creates and sustains body and mind. Thinking, we are told, is the breathing of the lower soul. The Secret of the Golden Flower tells us that due to the claustrophobia of being absorbed in the minute details of a living body, the lower soul is attracted to death and destruction, because then the soul is liberated. Here perhaps is an explanation of Freud's death wish. The mystical Neoplatonist Plotinus describes something similar in Aeneid 4:8-4. When a soul remains for too long in this withdrawal and estrangement from the whole, with never a glance at understanding, it becomes a thing fragmented, isolated, and weak. Activity lacks concentration. Attention is tied to particulars. Severed from the whole, the soul clings to the part, to this one only thing, tossed about by an entire world of things. It turned and gave itself away. Adrift now from the whole, it manages even this particular thing with difficulty, unquote. We see all around us a world infatuated with mortality. Games glamorize killing. Films glorify the gruesome details of carnage and slow motion. Television provides a steady diet of crimes and tragedies, especially murders, real and fictional. Mass shootings make the feed almost daily. Most people live their lives conscious of only the lower soul. In many traditional esoteric and spiritualist traditions, we are told that if all we are conscious of is the lower soul during a lifetime, when we shed our bodies, we quickly forget that life as we bounce from reaction to reaction on our way to the next. But as we have seen, we also have another soul, or rather the part of the soul that watches, having never become involved in the minute details of physical organs and functions, and the mastery of 10,000 skills, beginning with eating, walking, and talking. The higher soul, we are told by the secret of the golden flower, loves life. Most of us have had at least one moment when our minds seem to open to consciousness that is like cloudless sky, and a sense of deep appreciation overcomes us. Moments when we stand outside ourselves in the ecstasy of the mystery of life give us glimpses of our true nature. Paul Brunton called the higher soul, quote, the overself, unquote. The popular term in the American New Age movement of the late 20th century was the higher self. Other cultural representations of this mystery make more complicated divisions than simply higher and lower. Plato described the soul as having three parts. Among the Neoplatonists, the anatomy of the soul became a ladder from the physical matter used by souls to build forms up to the good, the true, the beautiful. Ancient civilizations, including Egypt, also divided the soul into more than three parts. Theosophy, with 7 vehicles of the soul, helped popularize the idea of the astral body at the turn of the 20th century, offering a complex diagram of the different bodies inhabited by a soul. But what good is exploring spiritual anatomy if we forget to fall in love with life? The issue is complicated further by translation. For example, generations of Western scholars labored under the misunderstanding that the terms emptiness and nirvana at the heart of Buddhism and Taoism meant an ultimate denial of existence. But that is a misunderstanding of the meaning of emptiness. The consciousness of emptiness is not without contents, just as meditation is not without thoughts. In deep meditation, the world can seem to blissfully melt away into light. That light is full, not empty. A better translation of emptiness, in my opinion, is sky-like. The consciousness of the higher soul is like sky. It contains all. Non-attachment flows from sky-like mind. Without an easily bruised ego to get in the way, a mind like sky can avoid a lot of trouble. This mind like sky is the goal of martial arts teachers who say that when fighters achieve it, opponents do not fight against them, but against the Tao. Did The Secret of the Golden Flower inform The Unobstructed Universe, which was published 3 years after Richard Wilhelm's English translation? Wilhelm was a friend of Carl Jung's, whose own writing about The Secret and its great influence on his work is compromised by Wilhelm's limited access to Chinese scholars. For example, Wilhelm translates Chinese that indicates spirit or mind that is attained openness and perfected action as, quote, God of utmost emptiness and life, end quote, not really conveying the meaning very well. A Christian himself, Wilhelm believed the origin of the secret of the golden flower might be found in the Nestorian Christianity of the 7th century, a theory contradicted by recent research. Chinese traditions claim an origin in the 12th century. We can be certain that the written text as we have it was created by 2 groups of students, first in 1688 and then in 1692. We found no reference to Wilhelm's book while researching the work and biographies of Stewart and Betty White. In fact, The Unobstructed Universe resembles Wilhelm's translation, the only one available at the time, less than it does Thomas Cleary's more recent translation, which was not available to the whites because it was published so much later. For example, Wilhelm misinterpreted The Secret of the Golden Flower as requiring seclusion and non-activity, while Cleary's translation, like the teachings of the Invisibles, emphasizes the need for healthy work and involvement in community. Perhaps more interesting than the question of influence is the possibility that both the unobstructed universe and the secret of the golden flower are describing the same experience. Here are some of the similarities. The Whites pointed out that stopping thought can be a very wearying exercise and has been a barrier to many beginners learning to meditate. They suggest there's no need to stop thinking. Instead, simply observe thoughts passing through. Don't take the rides they offer. Don't identify with them. Just as you go about your day not noticing every breath, so too you can let thoughts go by. You are not your thoughts. You are what observes them. Cleary makes the same point in his translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower. Quote, "So should one have no thoughts? It is impossible to have no thoughts. Should one not breathe? It is impossible not to breathe. Nothing compares to making the affliction itself into medicine, which means to have mind and breath rest on each other. Therefore, turning the breath around should be included in turning the light around," end quote. Don't try to stop thoughts. Just let them float by while focusing attention on making breathing as slow and quiet, as peaceful as we can. That's how the practice begins. A key aphorism from the material channeled by the Whites is, quote, "Attention is existence," unquote. Or as Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower explains it, quote, "People create the body by attention. The body is not just a physical body because there is a lower soul therein. The lower soul functions in association with consciousness, and consciousness develops based on the lower soul. The lower soul is dim. It is the substance of consciousness. If consciousness is not interrupted, transformation and transmutation of the lower soul go on endlessly from lifetime to lifetime, generation to generation," end quote. The Whites would have phrased it differently, but they were describing the same thing. The obstructed consciousness, they said, dulled by having a body, may spend lifetimes in the vortex, never realizing the unobstructed truth. Betty described the afterlife condition of people who lived unexamined lives as, quote, "gelatinous," unquote. We lavish attention on movies, gossip, games. Many people know more about their favorite celebrities than they do about themselves. As Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower puts it, nothing is worse than to have a running leakage of spirit and consciousness. Betty described the process of building a new body in the unobstructed. She compared herself to a helpless newborn infant. Slowly, she was able to grow and nourish the spiritual body she would inhabit in the unobstructed after death. In Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower, this process is described. Quote, "When you first put this technique into practice, there is seemingly non-being within being. Eventually, when the work is accomplished and there is a body beyond your body, there is seemingly being in non-being," end quote. Betty talked about how she began with nothing more than a disembodied point of view in the unobstructed universe. She compared the experience to being a single atom or molecule of unique consciousness. From this point, she had to build a new body in the unobstructed. According to Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower, quote, After 100 days, the light is spontaneous. The point of true positive energy suddenly produces a pearl, just as an embryo forms from the intercourse of a man and a woman, end quote. What is this body beyond body like? Betty described the ability to enter or pass through any material object to experience and even co-create the obstructed from the unobstructed. But she presents herself and experiences her companions in recognizable forms of shining, warm, colorful light. The golden flower is light, says Cleary's translation. Quote, this is the absolutely unified real energy of celestial immortals, end quote. Betty may not have described herself as a celestial immortal, but she is describing the same process of creating a timeless body of light. As we've seen, the Whites were adamant that one live a full life in the obstructed universe, to experience the world and to contribute something useful to the community aside from chasing immortality. Or as Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower says, quote, first establish a firm foothold in daily activities within society. Only then can you cultivate reality and understand essence, unquote. The Whites insisted that one should never strain when pursuing these matters. Progress should be easy since it's natural. Cleary's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower says, quote, naturalness is called the way, end quote. As we have seen, the Whites described current attitudes toward aging as, quote, Neanderthal superstitions, end quote. They believed people prematurely age themselves not only by doing the wrong things with their minds and bodies, but by omitting the right things and by believing in a kind of collective delusion of what to expect as they age. As Cleary's The Secret of the Golden Flower puts it, quote, usually people wind up pursuing objects and come to age in conformity with life, never once looking back, end quote. In Betty's phraseology, they become creatures of the obstructed, trapped in the vortex. The Secret of the Golden Flower describes this sorry human condition. Quote, in a single day, one breathes countless times. So has countless random thoughts. When the luminosity of spirit has leaked out completely, one is like a withered tree or dead ashes, end quote. The Whites recommended a healing meditation involving noticing, not imagining, a vast but subtle river of healing. This distinction between making yourself see something that isn't there and noticing something subtle that is can also be found in The Secret of the Golden Flower. Quote, it is also essential to understand that this device is not mechanical or forced. Just maintain a subtle looking and listening, unquote. These are only a few of the similarities to be found between these seemingly very different sets of teachings. The Whites appear to be describing the same process as The Secret of the Golden Flower. Both present the concept of attaining unobstructed consciousness. Cleary translates the Daoist sage Liu Yiming, quote, when yin and yang combine into one, the celestial order is clearly revealed. The innate knowledge and capacity which had been about to fade away in people is round and bright, clean and bare. A bead of gold elixir hangs in the center of vast space, lighting up the universe to view, unobstructed in all directions, unquote. To add further mystery to the similarities, we must consider the possibility that The Secret of the Golden Flower and the Unobstructed Universe teachings may have had a similar origin. Monica Esposito of Kyoto University, in her article, quote, The Secret of the Golden Flower and the establishment of the Longmen tradition at Mount Jinggai during the Qing dynasty, end quote, writes, quote, the Chinese text used by Wilhelm is Zhanran Huizhenji's edition, published between 1921 and 1927, and found, as its preface explains, in Beijing's Liuli Shang, the old street of books and antique dealers. In reality, many other versions of the Golden Flower text exist, all traditionally attributed to the immortal Liu Dongbin. The texts date back to the Qing dynasty, 1644 to 1911, and belong to various Daoist lineages and traditions. So far, I have discovered at least 7 editions of this text. Among them, a rare one at the Otani University Library in Kyoto. The text is a product of spirit writing seances, end quote. This confirms what Chung Yuan Chang argued in his 1956 Eranos lecture, The Secret of the Golden Flower, originated from, quote, a flying spirit pencil, end quote, or as Pregadio translates it, quote, spirit writing, end quote. The popular term in English is automatic writing, which is where Betty got her start. We have a helpful little visual for you, so you can see some of these similarities. In The Secret of the Golden Flower, we have Quan Gen immortals. In the Unobstructed Universe, we have invisibles. In the Golden Flower, we have attention creates bodies. In the Unobstructed Universe, we have attention is existence. In the Golden Flower, we have reincarnation in samsara. In the Unobstructed Universe, we have reincarnation in vortex. In the Golden Flower, we have leakage of consciousness. In the Unobstructed Universe, we have gelatinous consciousness. In the Golden Flower, we have body beyond the body. In the Unobstructed Universe, this is called the beta body. In the Golden Flower, we have celestial immortals. In the Unobstructed Universe, we have bodies of light. In the Golden Flower, we have the need to establish daily activities. In the Unobstructed Universe, we are told to live a full life. In Golden Flower, we age by conformity. In the Unobstructed Universe, we age by superstition. In the Golden Flower, the origin seems to be spirit writing. The Unobstructed Universe originated in mediumship. Golden Flower, 17th century China. Unobstructed Universe, 20th century America. This brings us to the end of our series on the Unobstructed Way, a book that Tamra and I wrote about the teachings of the Unobstructed Universe by Stewart Edward White and the amazing medium, his wife, Betty. We hope that you've enjoyed this and that you have learned some comforting and inspiring things from these extraordinary teachings. And as you can see, there are similarities to the teachings of Plato and of The Secret of the Golden Flower are profound. Thank you again for joining us. And if you liked this, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, something that will let us know that you'd like to see more content.